I still remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong at my son's wedding, and it wasn't the music or the flowers or the way the ballroom lights shimmered across 260 smiling faces. It was a single line printed on a small white name card waiting for me at the back of the reception hall. The card read, "Daniel's mother, table 23." And table 23 was the very last table in the room, tucked beside a decorative pillar and the emergency exit where the music sounded distant, and the laughter from the front felt like it belonged to another world. I paused there for a second, holding the card between my fingers, listening to the soft clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation around me. I told myself it was nothing. Weddings are chaotic. Seating charts get complicated when you have that many guests. Maybe someone simply made a mistake. I smoothed the front of my navy dress, the one I had bought 3 weeks earlier after Ashley insisted the colors for the wedding party would be ivory and pale gold, and I didn't want to clash with the photos. When Daniel was a boy, he used to say navy blue made me look strong like a captain, and the memory made me smile as I took my seat at the table that felt strangely far from everything. From there I could see the head table glowing beneath a canopy of white roses and warm string lights. Ashley sat at the center beside my son, radiant in her gown, laughing easily with her parents and bridesmaids. Her family filled the front tables, their voices confident, their champagne glasses never empty. I folded my hands on the tablecloth and watched the room the way you do when you're older and used to noticing things other people miss. The photographers circled the dance floor. The band played a cheerful jazz tune. Waiters carried plates past my chair toward tables that were already half finished with their dinners. And Daniel never once looked toward table 23. It wasn't anger I felt then. Not even sadness, exactly. It was more like the quiet sensation you get when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place and you realize the picture forming in front of you is not the one you thought you were building. Ashley had planned every detail of this wedding for months. She had spreadsheets, color palettes, rehearsal dinners, and group chats that buzzed with constant updates I rarely saw. I had told myself that was normal. Young couples like control. Young brides want everything perfect. But as the evening moved forward and the speeches began, I noticed something else. Every toast mentioned Ashley's family. Her father's generosity. Her mother's elegance. Her childhood stories. The room laughed warmly each time, and I smiled along with them, lifting my glass whenever everyone else did. Then Ashley stood for her own toast, holding a slender flute of champagne as the band quieted and 260 guests turned their attention toward her. The room grew still in that polite, expectant way people do at weddings, waiting for something heartfelt, something sentimental, something sweet. Ashley glanced across the tables, her eyes bright with amusement, and for a brief moment they landed on me at the back of the room before she leaned toward the microphone and began speaking. She began with a bright smile, the kind people use when they know a room is ready to laugh. The microphone caught the soft echo of her voice as she thanked everyone for coming, thanked her parents for their love, thanked the bridesmaids for their endless help during what she called the most magical year of her life. People nodded along. Glasses lifted slightly. It sounded like every wedding speech anyone had ever heard. I folded my hands on the table and watched the lights reflecting across the rows of white plates and gold napkins. The band members stood quietly near the stage, waiting for the moment the speech would end so the celebration could continue. Ashley spoke about how she first met Daniel, how charming he was, how he made her laugh during a rainy afternoon at a small coffee shop in Portland. The room reacted warmly. Someone at the front laughed out loud when she described his terrible sense of direction and how he once drove the wrong way down a one-way street during their second date. Daniel smiled beside her, shaking his head as if he had heard the story many times before. Then Ashley paused and tilted her head slightly, looking across the room as if searching for someone. Her eyes traveled slowly over the tables until they found me near the back. For just a second she held that gaze, and something in her expression felt deliberate, almost theatrical. She lifted her glass slightly higher and said that none of Daniel's success would have been possible without the woman who raised him. Several guests turned in their seats, trying to follow her line of sight. I felt their eyes moving across the tables until a few of them finally noticed me sitting quietly near the pillar. Someone gave a polite little clap. Ashley laughed softly and said yes. She meant Daniel's mother, the woman who had spent years shaping him into the man standing beside her tonight. For a brief moment the words sounded kind, almost generous. Then she added that every family has a phase where parents try to hold on a little too tightly, especially when they are not quite ready to accept that time moves forward. A few guests chuckled, thinking it was harmless humor. Ashley took a slow sip of champagne and continued in the same playful tone, saying that Daniel always told her his mother worried about everything, from his college grades to the color of the napkins at this very wedding. The room laughed more confidently now. She leaned toward the microphone again and said that at some point every son has to step out from under his mother's shadow and build a life of his own. The laughter grew louder, rolling across the ballroom like a small wave. Then she smiled brightly and delivered the final line as if it were the most natural punchline in the world. She said that tonight was proof Daniel had grown up and that his mother could finally relax because her job was finished. She added that these days she mostly thought of Daniel's mother as a harmless, slightly dramatic, but ultimately useless old woman who no longer had anything important to worry about. The laughter arrived instantly, louder than before, the kind that spreads quickly when people believe they are hearing a clever joke. I did not move. I simply lifted my glass, took a small sip of champagne, and listened to the sound of 260 guests laughing while my son sat beside his bride and said nothing at all. I did not lower my glass right away. The champagne was cool and dry, and for a moment I focused on the simple sensation of it rather than the sound of laughter filling the ballroom. When you reach a certain age you learn that silence can say more than anger ever could. I set the glass gently back on the table and looked toward the front of the room again. Ashley was smiling as if she had just told the most charming story of the evening. Several guests were still laughing softly. Others nodded with the polite approval people offer when they believe a joke has landed well. Daniel sat beside her, one hand resting on the table, the other still holding his own glass. He did not laugh as loudly as the others, but he did not interrupt either. He simply looked down for a moment and then back toward the guests, as if waiting for the next part of the celebration to begin. From table 23 the distance between us felt larger than the size of the ballroom. I noticed small details the way I always do. The golden ribbon tied around the floral arrangements. The soft glow of the chandelier above the dance floor. The quiet movement of a waiter clearing empty plates from a nearby table. Weddings are full of beautiful distractions, little pieces of elegance designed to keep everyone comfortable and entertained. I folded my hands again and allowed the room to settle after the laughter faded. Ashley continued speaking for another minute, offering cheerful thanks to her parents and to the guests who had traveled from different states to attend the ceremony. Her voice carried easily through the speakers, confident and smooth. Eventually the band struck a gentle chord to signal the end of the toast. Glasses lifted once more. The crowd applauded. The moment passed quickly, as most uncomfortable moments do when surrounded by music and celebration. Yet something inside me had grown very still. It was the same quiet feeling I used to get when Daniel was a little boy, and I could sense he was about to tell me a story that was not entirely true. Mothers learn to recognize those moments. They arrive softly, without warning, and suddenly everything becomes clear. I remembered the months leading up to this wedding. The long phone calls about venues and guest lists. The polite messages from Ashley explaining that certain decisions had already been made. The way my suggestions were always acknowledged with a smile, but rarely followed. At the time I told myself it was simply the way modern weddings worked. Younger people like to handle things themselves. They like independence. I respected that. I believed stepping back was the right thing to do. Still, sitting there beneath the dim light near the exit, listening to the band begin the first slow dance, I realized something else. Ashley had not spoken those words carelessly. She had planned them. The pause before she looked across the room. The laughter she expected. The confidence in her voice. None of that had been accidental. I watched the newly married couple walk toward the center of the dance floor as the music swelled gently around them. Guests gathered closer, phones raised to capture the moment. For a few seconds no one paid attention to the woman seated alone at table 23. And that was perfectly fine with me. Because when a room grows that comfortable, when everyone believes the story has already been written, that is usually the moment when the truth finally has space to appear. I remained seated while the first dance began, watching the slow movement of the couple in the center of the floor as the band played a gentle melody that filled the ballroom with a kind of warm nostalgia. Daniel placed his hand carefully at the small of Ashley's back, and she rested her head slightly toward his shoulder as if the world around them had faded away. Guests gathered closer, forming a loose circle around the dance floor. Phones were lifted. Soft applause drifted through the room whenever the music reached a familiar note. From where I sat, the entire scene looked almost like a photograph someone had carefully arranged, elegant and glowing under the chandelier light. I noticed the wedding planner standing near the stage, quietly checking a clipboard while speaking with one of the servers. I recognized her immediately because we had spoken several times during the planning months earlier. Her name was Rebecca, and she had always been polite, professional, and slightly surprised when I introduced myself as Daniel's mother. Not surprised in a rude way, just surprised in the quiet way people become when they realize the person paying for something is not the person making the decisions. I had noticed that expression before. I noticed many small expressions these days. The music continued, and the couple rotated slowly across the polished floor while the guests watched with affectionate smiles. Someone at the nearby table commented about how beautiful the bride looked. Another guest mentioned how lucky Daniel was to have married into such a lively family. I nodded slightly when they glanced in my direction, offering the kind of calm smile that keeps conversations comfortable. In truth, I did not feel angry. Anger is loud and messy and tends to draw attention. What I felt instead was a quiet clarity that settled into place the same way evening light settles across a quiet street. When you reach 72 years of age, you learn that people reveal themselves slowly over time, through small decisions that seem unimportant in the moment. I thought about the first meeting Ashley and I had nearly 2 years earlier at a small restaurant downtown. She had arrived 20 minutes late, but greeted me warmly, speaking with the kind of easy confidence that made everyone around her feel included. She complimented Daniel constantly during that dinner, laughing at his jokes and praising his ambition. I remember thinking he had chosen someone energetic and determined, which seemed like a good balance for his quieter nature. Later that evening, as the bill arrived, Ashley casually pushed it toward Daniel with a playful smile and said that since his mother had invited them, she was certain I would not mind taking care of it. It had been such a small moment that I almost forgot about it afterward. Yet sitting there now at table 23 while the dance floor glowed with soft golden light, I realized how many moments like that had appeared over the past 2 years. Each one small, each one polite, each one easy to dismiss, until eventually they began to form a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The music slowed toward its final notes, and the guests applauded again as Daniel gently spun Ashley once before the song ended. The room felt relaxed and cheerful, exactly the way a wedding reception is supposed to feel. Rebecca, the wedding planner, stepped toward the microphone stand to prepare for the next announcement, while servers carried fresh glasses of champagne across the room. I lifted my own glass again, watching the bubbles rise quietly through the pale gold liquid. From the outside, I must have looked like any other guest enjoying the celebration. And in many ways I was. Because sometimes the most important part of a story is not the moment when someone speaks carelessly into a microphone. Sometimes it is the quiet moment afterward when another person decides exactly what to do next. The applause from the first dance slowly faded as the band shifted into a lighter tune, something cheerful that encouraged people to leave their chairs and join the floor. Guests began standing, smoothing their jackets and adjusting their dresses while the energy in the ballroom warmed again. Laughter returned to the room, the easy kind that travels between tables when people feel comfortable and well-fed. I remained at table 23 for a few moments longer, watching the movement of the crowd with the calm patience that comes naturally after many years of observing family gatherings. A young server approached with a silver tray of fresh champagne glasses, and I thanked him quietly as I exchanged my empty one. The new glass felt cool in my hand. Across the room, Daniel was speaking with Ashley's parents while several of the bridesmaids gathered around them, their voices bright and excited. Ashley herself moved gracefully through the guests, accepting compliments and small hugs from relatives who had traveled across the country for the celebration. She looked perfectly at ease, the way someone looks when the evening has unfolded exactly as expected. I noticed Rebecca, the wedding planner, again near the side of the stage, speaking with the band leader while glancing occasionally at her clipboard. Her posture was composed but attentive, the way professionals remain when they know the schedule of an event down to the minute. After a short while she walked across the room, weaving carefully between the tables until she reached mine. She greeted me with the same polite smile I remembered from our earlier meetings. She asked softly if everything was comfortable and whether I needed anything. I told her the evening was beautiful and that she had organized it very well. She seemed relieved by the compliment and nodded with appreciation before mentioning that there would be another round of short toasts later in the evening if anyone else wished to say a few words. I thanked her for letting me know. She paused for a moment as if deciding whether to say something more, then gently reminded me that if I wanted to speak she could arrange it easily. Her voice was careful, respectful, and perhaps just a little curious. I looked toward the dance floor again, where Daniel and Ashley had begun greeting guests who stepped forward to congratulate them. The room looked warm and lively under the chandelier light. 260 people talking, laughing, celebrating the beginning of a new marriage. I lifted the champagne glass slightly and watched the bubbles rise toward the surface. For a brief moment, I thought about the many years that had led to this evening. The long hours of work when Daniel was young. The school plays and baseball games. The quiet nights when I balanced bills at the kitchen table while he studied at the other end with his textbooks spread across the wood. Life has a way of building itself slowly, piece by piece, until suddenly you find yourself sitting in a ballroom surrounded by strangers who know your child as an adult rather than the small boy you once carried through a grocery store aisle. Rebecca waited patiently beside the table while I considered her question. Then I set the champagne glass down, folded my hands once more, and told her that perhaps later in the evening I might like to say a few words after all. Rebecca nodded with quiet understanding when I said I might like to speak later in the evening. She wrote something on the corner of her clipboard and assured me that she would find the right moment once the next round of dances and dinner service had finished. Her voice carried the calm tone of someone who had organized many celebrations and knew that timing was everything. After she walked away, I remained seated for a few minutes, watching the rhythm of the reception unfold. The dance floor filled gradually as couples stepped forward to join the music. Some moved gracefully while others laughed at their own clumsy steps, and the sound of the band echoed warmly across the ballroom walls. At nearby tables, people leaned closer to talk over the music, sharing stories about travel plans and old family memories. The atmosphere was light and cheerful, the way wedding receptions are meant to feel. From time to time, guests approached Daniel and Ashley with congratulations, and the photographer followed them patiently, capturing each handshake and smiling embrace. I noticed Daniel glancing around the room occasionally as if searching for someone he had not yet greeted. Once his eyes moved toward the back where I sat, but the moment passed quickly when another guest tapped his shoulder to offer a toast. I lifted my glass again and took a small sip, letting the cool taste settle slowly. When you spend many years raising a child, you grow used to moments of waiting. Waiting outside classrooms when school ends. Waiting in a car during long practices. Waiting in quiet rooms while doctors explain small childhood illnesses. Patience becomes a habit over time, and habits remain even when children become adults. Across the room, Ashley laughed brightly with a group of her cousins, the sound carrying easily through the music. She looked confident and relaxed, moving through the evening as if the entire celebration belonged naturally to her. I watched her expression carefully, the same way I used to study Daniel's face when he was young and learning to hide disappointment after losing a baseball game. People reveal more than they realize when they think no one is paying attention. The band finished another song, and applause drifted through the room again, while servers began placing fresh plates of dessert along the tables. The scent of warm vanilla and baked pastry spread softly through the air. A few minutes later, Rebecca returned to the microphone near the stage and thanked everyone for their patience while the evening continued. She mentioned that there would soon be a few additional words shared by family members before the next dance began. Her voice was calm and welcoming, and several guests turned their chairs slightly toward the stage in anticipation. I set my glass down carefully and rested my hands on the edge of the tablecloth. There was no hurry in my movements. Moments like this do not require urgency. They require clarity. For a brief second, I looked around the ballroom once more, taking in the soft lights, the laughter, the gentle music that had begun again behind Rebecca's voice. 260 people celebrating a marriage that had just begun. Then Rebecca glanced toward the back of the room, caught my eye with a polite nod, and lifted the microphone slightly as she announced that Daniel's mother would now like to share a few words. I stood slowly from my chair at table 23, smoothing the front of my navy, dressed the same way I had done earlier in the evening, and for a moment I could feel several nearby guests turning their attention toward me as Rebecca waited beside the microphone. The walk across the ballroom floor was not long, perhaps 30 feet at most, yet it felt like crossing the quiet space between two very different versions of the same evening. Conversations softened as I moved past the tables. A few people offered polite smiles, the kind people give when they recognize a family member but are not quite sure what will be said next. Daniel noticed me halfway through that walk. His expression shifted slightly, a small tightening around his eyes that only a mother would recognize. Ashley followed his gaze and looked toward me as well, her champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. From the center of the room the lights seemed brighter, the music softer, and the murmur of 260 guests settled into a patient silence. Rebecca handed me the microphone with a respectful nod before stepping aside. I held the microphone carefully, feeling its light weight in my hand, and looked across the room for a moment before speaking. When you have lived long enough, you understand that the first sentence matters more than anything that follows. I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate Daniel and Ashley, and I said it was a beautiful evening. A few guests nodded politely. I mentioned how much effort goes into planning a wedding like this, from the flowers to the music to the dinner service that had kept everyone comfortable all night. The bandleader smiled faintly from his corner near the stage. I spoke slowly, not because I was nervous, but because calm words travel farther than rushed ones. Then I shared a small memory about Daniel as a boy, how when he was about 8 years old he insisted on building a treehouse behind our old house using little more than a hammer, a handful of crooked nails, and a determination that made me both proud and slightly worried. The guests laughed gently at the image of a small boy determined to build something far bigger than himself. I said that raising a child is a lot like that treehouse project. At the beginning, you spend most of your time steadying the ladder and handing over tools, hoping that the structure they are building will stand strong once they climb inside it. Several people smiled at that comparison. I glanced briefly toward Daniel and saw him listening now with a quieter expression. Ashley stood beside him, her posture straight, her smile polite but thinner than before. I paused just long enough for the room to settle again before continuing. I said that earlier in the evening there had been a very memorable toast that mentioned me, and I appreciated that people had found it amusing. A few scattered chuckles appeared from the tables, though they faded quickly when they realized I was not laughing along. I nodded calmly and said that humor can be a wonderful part of family gatherings, especially when it reminds us how life changes over time. Then I added gently that sometimes jokes also reveal something important about how people see one another. The room had grown completely still now, 260 guests watching quietly. I rested my free hand on the edge of the podium and looked across the ballroom once more, my voice steady and warm as I said that since I had been mentioned earlier this evening, I thought it might be a good moment to clarify a few things about the role I have played in Daniel's life. The room remained completely still after my last sentence, the kind of quiet that only appears when people sense that something more meaningful is about to be said. I rested both hands lightly on the podium and let my eyes move slowly across the ballroom, taking in the faces of guests who had traveled from different cities and states to be here tonight. Some of them were smiling politely, expecting another sentimental story. Others looked curious, perhaps remembering the earlier toast and wondering how I might respond. I began by saying that raising Daniel had been the most important project of my life, something far more meaningful than any career title or accomplishment. When he was small, I worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs at once, not because I enjoyed being busy, but because I wanted him to grow up without worrying about the things that often trouble children when money is tight. I explained that there were years when the house was quiet after he went to bed and I sat at the kitchen table reviewing bills, making sure that tuition payments and school supplies were covered before anything else. Several guests nodded gently as they listened. Parents understand those kinds of choices. I said that as Daniel grew older, those responsibilities changed shape. College arrived, and with it came tuition payments, apartment deposits, textbooks, and long drives across state lines when he needed help moving into another dorm room or beginning his first job. Through all of those years, I never considered the effort a burden. It was simply what mothers do when they want their children to stand confidently on their own feet. I paused for a moment then, letting the words settle naturally before continuing. I mentioned that many people assume when a mother grows older her role slowly disappears, as if the years of support quietly fade once a child becomes an adult. A few guests shifted slightly in their chairs. I spoke calmly, explaining that sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the foundation built during those earlier years continues to support the next stage of life in ways people do not always notice. I looked briefly toward Daniel and Ashley before continuing. I said that earlier someone had described me as a useless old woman, and I understood why the comment seemed funny at first. After all, from a distance it might appear that my work ended long ago. But I explained gently that certain responsibilities do not end simply because a child grows up. Some of them evolve quietly behind the scenes. I then thanked the guests again for attending the celebration and for honoring Daniel and Ashley with their presence. My voice remained steady as I added that weddings are moments when families come together not only to celebrate love, but also to recognize the many people who helped make that moment possible. The room had grown so quiet that even the band members stood motionless near their instruments. I took a small breath and said that since humor had already played a role in the evening, perhaps it was fair for me to share one final detail that might help everyone understand the situation a little more clearly. I let the silence remain for a moment longer because silence has a way of sharpening attention better than any raised voice ever could. 260 guests were watching now, some leaning forward slightly, others holding their glasses halfway to their lips without realizing it. I smiled gently and said that when Daniel was young, he once asked me why people build strong foundations under houses that no one ever sees. He had been about 10 years old at the time and curious about everything, especially the way things worked. I told him that a good foundation is not meant to be noticed. It exists so the house above it can stand tall without worry. Several guests nodded quietly at that memory, and I continued by saying that over the years I had done my best to be that kind of foundation for my son. Not visible most of the time, not asking for applause, simply making sure that when he stepped forward into the world, he would have steady ground beneath him. I glanced toward Daniel again, and his expression had softened into something thoughtful now, the way people look when they suddenly recognize the weight of old memories. Ashley remained beside him with her glass still in her hand, her smile polite but no longer effortless. I said that earlier someone had described me as useless, and I understood that perhaps it sounded like a harmless joke during a joyful evening. Humor often travels quickly in rooms like this. But I explained calmly that even a foundation eventually finishes its work once the structure above it is complete. I paused for a brief moment before adding that tonight felt like the right time for me to step back and allow the new household Daniel and Ashley are building to stand entirely on its own. A few guests exchanged curious glances, unsure where my words were leading. I thanked everyone again for sharing this celebration and said that it had truly been a beautiful evening. Then I added one final detail in the same calm tone I had used from the beginning. I explained that earlier in the year Daniel had asked for my help organizing many parts of this wedding, and I had been happy to assist because seeing your child begin a new chapter of life is one of the great joys of parenthood. I mentioned that the venue reservation, the band, the dinner service, and several other arrangements had been coordinated through my accounts simply because it was easier that way during the planning months. A soft ripple of understanding moved through the room as guests processed the meaning behind those words. I smiled again, not unkindly, and said that since I had apparently reached the stage of life where my role was considered unnecessary, I thought it would be respectful to step aside completely starting tonight. I lifted the microphone slightly and added that tomorrow morning those arrangements would continue under the responsibility of the newly married couple themselves, just as it should be when two adults begin building a future together. The room remained quiet, though the silence now carried a very different weight than before. I thanked everyone once more for their kindness, wished Daniel and Ashley a long and happy marriage, and gently returned the microphone to Rebecca before stepping away from the podium, leaving the ballroom filled with the soft realization that sometimes the calmest words can echo the longest.